In the winter of 1882, while the northern plains lay locked beneath a white death and most men fought only for their next breath, a lost homesteader named David made a choice that would haunt a frontier town for decades. A hidden family sheltered him in a place no outsider was ever meant to see, a steaming pool that defied the blizzard. He swore silence. They called him a fool, then a liar. But the truth was neither geology nor luck. It was a bond the snow itself would hide until the season of reckoning. David was a homesteader who walked into a whiteout in the Nebraska Territory with a broken leg and no hope. A family from a hidden band of Lakota found him half frozen, dragged him to a geothermal pool that steamed like a miracle in the absolute cold. They saved his life in exchange for one promise: the spring must remain secret. When he staggered back to the settlement, the town saw a man who refused to share a treasure. They called it greed, then cowardice, then outright betrayal. He endured the scorn while his farm grew inexplicably rich through the hardest winters. What no one could see was the real transaction. His loyalty had purchased a fraction of that sacred water, and a bond that would be tested when the Lakota family came to him one night, shivering and exiled, asking for the shelter they had once given him. The promise weighed on David like a yoke he had chosen to wear, not one forced upon him. When he limped into the settlement of Loop Fork 3 days after the blizzard, using a crutch of rough cedar and wearing a story that seemed full of holes, the questions began before he had even reached the general store. He told them he had sheltered in a trapper dugout. He told them his leg had mended on its own with rest and time. But the men who hauled him inside by the fire saw no frostbite, no hollow cheeks, no tremor of a man who had survived 3 nights under drifts. What they saw was a homesteader who looked rested, almost whole, and far too quiet about how he had returned from a storm that had killed 2 other men along the same trail. The first winter passed with the town watching him. David worked his patch of bottomland with no more help than a single mule, and he appeared to prosper in quiet ways. His few head of cattle stayed fat when neighbors' stock froze. His well never iced over entirely, even when the temperature dropped past 30 below. The county land agent, a man named Rigby who had grown wealthy off desperate settlers, began paying closer attention. He had platted most of the valley himself and knew every spring, seep, and creek for 30 miles. David's farm, on paper, held nothing of value, but Rigby had learned to read the land by the things it hid, not the things it showed. And so one afternoon in early spring, he rode out with a deputy surveyor and 2 hired men, and they combed David's quarter section without asking permission. They found dry ground, a sluggish creek that froze solid by November, and absolutely nothing to explain the warmth. Rigby left angry and unconvinced, telling anyone who would listen that David had stolen a secret the whole territory had a right to know. The rumors calcified into a single belief. Somewhere in the bluffs beyond the river, David had found a hot spring that belonged to no one, and he was hoarding its power for himself. There was no other way to explain his survival. His silence was taken as guilt, and soon the town's attitude hardened from curiosity into cold resentment. Men who had once shared coffee with him at the livery stable stopped meeting his eyes. The blacksmith began charging him double for shoeing the mule. At the feed store, his credit was cut without explanation. And on Sundays, when the small congregation gathered at the schoolhouse, the preacher's sermons about neighborly love and shared blessings never once looked in David's direction. He endured it all without protest, because every insult felt lighter than the weight of breaking the promise he had given the Lakota family in the snow. He had come to understand their fear during that first week in the hidden canyon. The father, a man called Red Willow, had spoken sparingly but directly, using a mixture of his own tongue, and the traders, English David could follow. The spring was not merely water, he explained, but a sacred place that had kept his small band alive through winters when the Bluecoat patrols pushed them into ever-shrinking corners of the territory. If the white settlements learned of its location, the army would build a fort on it within a season, or a speculator would fence it off before the families could gather their belongings. David had seen the truth of that prediction in Rigby's eyes the day he rode onto the quarter section. The man did not care about survival or loyalty. He cared about control, and David had decided that no amount of public scorn would make him the instrument of that theft. For 3 years, the pattern held. David kept the secret, the town kept its bitterness, and each winter David's farm somehow scraped through when others failed. A second blizzard struck the Loup Valley in December of 1885, and it was worse than the one that had nearly killed him. Drifts buried entire homesteads, smothered livestock, and collapsed roofs across the county. But David's small herd emerged lean, not starved. His hay stores lasted. The same men who had cursed his name now needed his surplus to survive, and they paid in strained silence at his door. It was a strange kind of justice, and it only deepened their resentment. How could a man who refused to share his secret still prosper, winter after winter, while decent families watched their children grow thin? The question hung over Loup Fork like smoke from a chimney that never quite cleared. Then came the fourth winter, and with it a change that nobody had foreseen. The army had been pushing the last scattered bands of Lakota onto the reservations, and a company of cavalry passed through the settlement in late autumn, heading northwest toward the Broken Country. They were hunting a small group of holdouts who had refused to surrender. David heard the news at the trading post and felt his stomach turn cold. He did not sleep that night, nor the night after. He stared at the ceiling beams and listened to the wind, while somewhere far beyond the river, a family that had once pulled him from the snow was being driven toward a fate he could only imagine. They came to him on a night when the moon was hidden and the temperature had dropped so low that even the coyotes had gone silent. He heard the soft knock at the door just past midnight, not the heavy fist of a neighbor, but something tentative, almost desperate. When he opened it, Red Willow stood in the frozen dark, his wife and 2 daughters huddled behind him, wrapped in worn blankets and shivering so violently that David could hear their teeth chattering from 10 feet away. Their camp had been burned, their horses taken. They had walked for 2 days through deep snow with only the clothes on their backs, and now they stood on his threshold, not as saviors, but as refugees asking for the same shelter they had once given him. David looked past them into the emptiness of the plains, then stepped back and opened the door wide. The secret was no longer only about a spring. It was now a crime. David closed the door softly, pressing the heavy crossbar into its iron brackets without a sound loud enough to carry beyond the porch. Inside, the 4 of them stood in a tight huddle just past the threshold, dripping meltwater onto the puncheon floor. Red Willow's face was gaunt, wind burned to the color of old leather, and his eyes held the same calm David remembered from the snow cave years before. His wife, Blue Corn, cradled the smaller daughter against her chest with arms that trembled from more than cold. The older girl, maybe 12, stared at David with a wariness that belonged to someone who had learned early that white men could offer warmth with one hand and betrayal with the other. None of them spoke. The only sound was the dry hiss of the stove and the faint rattle of frozen breath escaping chapped lips. David moved first. He pulled blankets from the bed, the spare wool one from the trunk, even the horse blanket folded near the door, and wrapped them around the family without ceremony. Then he stoked the fire until the iron belly glowed dull orange and set water to heat. He had no food ready, no plan, only the absolute certainty that if anyone in Loup Fork saw these 4 faces, the cavalry would arrive before the next sundown, and his cabin would become a trap of his own making. The root cellar was too shallow, the hayloft too exposed. But behind the cabin, beneath the lee of the low ridge where the ground never froze deeper than a foot, he had dug a storage pit for turnips and potatoes the previous autumn. It was cramped, low-roofed, and dark enough to hide a secret that could hang a man. He led them there through the back door after the moon slipped behind cloud cover. The girls whimpered once when the cold bit their cheeks again, then fell silent as the heavy plank lid closed above them. David spread straw and blankets over the dirt floor, left a lantern burning low, and promised to return before dawn with food. When he straightened up alone in the frozen yard, the weight of what he had just done settled over him like a second coat. He was no longer the eccentric who survived storms he should not have survived. He was an active accomplice to holdouts the United States Army was hunting with orders to shoot on sight if they resisted. The following morning, frost grew thick on every surface, and David forced himself to follow his ordinary routine. He watered the mule, checked the cattle, and walked the half-mile to the general store exactly as if nothing had changed. The air in Loup Fork felt taut that day. Men clustered outside the livery stable spoke in low tones and stopped talking when strangers approached. At Barden's trading post, where David usually picked up salt and coffee, the conversation was already running hot over a single piece of news. The cavalry had lost the trail of the fugitives somewhere north of the river and were now sweeping the whole valley, farm by farm. 3 homesteads had already been searched at dawn, cupboards emptied, root cellars prodded with bayonets. David bought twice his usual flour and a side of smoked pork without letting his hands shake. Barden, a fat man who missed nothing, noticed the extra and remarked that David must be expecting company. David said only that winter was long. Barden's eyes followed him out the door. That night, Red Willow spoke for the first time since the knock. They sat in the darkness of the storage pit, the lantern shielded so only a thin line of light escaped beneath the lid rim. Blue Corn and the girls slept fitfully in the corner, exhausted beyond the reach of fear. Red Willow's words came slowly, deliberately, in the same mixture of Lakota and broken English he had used years before. He told David that the spring was not merely warm water seeping from rock. It was a place the Creator had marked before any treaties were signed, before the first settlers crossed the Missouri. His ancestors had guarded it through 3 generations of encroachment, moving their camps whenever the white map lines shifted closer. They had never revealed its location to any outsider, not even to friendly traders, because once a single white foot touched that water, the army would build a fort on it and every family would be driven off into the barren country to starve. David was the first exception in decades, made only because he had been dying in the snow, and the old teachings demanded that a life spared must serve the balance. By keeping the secret through years of public scorn, David had proven that the balance still held. And then Red Willow said something that reoriented David's entire understanding of the past 4 winters. The strange luck of his farm, the unfrozen well, the cattle that stayed fat while neighbors' stock perished. None of that had come from the spring. It had come from the weather alone, from the particular shape of the low ridge that broke the worst winds, and from his own obsessive husbandry. The spring was miles away in a canyon David had never entered again after that first week. The town's accusation that he had hoarded a hidden resource was, in literal fact, false. Yet the myth had protected the true secret better than any lie ever could. While Rigby and the others wasted their rage on David's fanciful treasure, they never thought to search the real canyon beyond the river bend. The entire settlement had been staring at the wrong man for years. Now, however, Red Willow made an offer that would bind the 2 families together in ways neither could escape. Because David had sheltered them when he could have turned them away to die, he was no longer an outsider. He was kin, and a kinsman could be given a share of the sacred water, provided it was channeled in secret, used only for the land, and never sold for profit. Red Willow described an overflow channel from the spring that seeped downhill toward a dry wash, invisible from any trail. If David laid a pipeline of hollowed logs from that point to his own creek bed, the water would remain hidden beneath the ground, warming the soil just enough to keep his well open and his stock ponds thawed without ever revealing the source. The work would be brutal and slow, and any man who detected it could doom them all. But if David was willing, the spring would sustain his farm not by luck, but by right. David spent the rest of that night sitting motionless beside the lantern, turning the offer over in his mind like a stone whose sharp edges never dulled. He had spent years refusing to profit from the secret because no right existed to profit. Now a right was being given, but accepting it would link his survival to theirs in an unbreakable chain. If the spring was found, they would all hang together. He looked across the dim pit at the 2 sleeping girls, their faces half hidden beneath the horse blanket, and understood that the choice was not really a choice at all. By dawn, he had begun planning the route. The construction became a secret life lived after dark. Every night, once the settlement's lights winked out and the prairie grew silent, David harnessed the mule to a small sled and hauled lengths of hollow cedar trunk from a stand of dead timber 2 miles east. He worked by lantern light alone, digging a shallow trench that wound along the base of the ridge, through the willow thicket, and into the dry wash that ran past his lower pasture. The ground was iron-hard, frozen to the depth of a man's forearm, and the pick blade chipped through it only grudgingly. Each log segment had to be fitted end to end, sealed with strips of oiled canvas, and buried before morning so no trace of disturbed earth was visible. The work consumed him. His hands bled through gloves he could not afford to replace. His sleep shrank to 3 hours a day, snatched in the gray hours after the sun rose, when any outdoor movement could be mistaken for ordinary chores. Even so, he knew the household could not stay hidden indefinitely. The girls needed fresh air. The family needed food beyond what a bachelor's larder could supply. Red Willow helped burn his own small supply of dried meat, and Blue Corn sewed and mended inside the pit, while the children played a silent game of counting knots in the roof boards. The rhythm of the homestead grew strange, full of pauses and listening. Every hoofbeat on the trail meant a freeze. Every distant shout brought the family to tense silence. David learned to differentiate the sound of a passing rider from the heavy, deliberate approach of men bent on searching something. He became an expert in terror. Near midwinter, the cavalry patrol finally came to David's quarter section. A sergeant with a color of grizzled beard reined up in the yard just after noon with 6 troopers behind him, their carbines resting across saddle bows. David stood in the cabin doorway, blocking the entrance with his body as casually as he could manage, and answered the sergeant's questions in the same flat tone he had used with Rigby years before. No, he had seen no Lakota. No, no strangers had passed his way. Yes, they were welcome to search. The soldiers tramped through the cabin, flipped the mattress, opened the flue, and one thick-necked trooper even stomped down the root cellar steps without finding anything beyond potatoes and a dusty keg of salt pork. The storage pit beyond the ridge lay, naturally concealed beneath a drift that looked exactly like every other drift on the farm. The sergeant left unsatisfied, warning David that hiding fugitives was a hanging offense, and that the army had informants in every settlement. David watched the patrol disappear into the white haze and felt the cold sweat freeze against his shirt. Rigby did not ride with the soldiers that day, but he started visiting more often, always alone, always unannounced, riding slowly around the farm's perimeter as though inspecting fence lines. David noticed the land agent's attention fixed on a particular spot near the lower pasture, where a shallow steam vent had begun rising from the ground during the coldest mornings. The pipeline was working, almost too well. The warm water, barely above body heat by the time it traveled the hollow logs, still released a faint vapor where it emerged into the stock pond, and on windless days that vapor stood visible for minutes before dissipating. It was a whisper of evidence, thin as breath, but enough for a man who had spent years convincing himself a secret existed anyway. One afternoon, Rigby stopped his horse directly beside the vent and dismounted. He crouched in the frozen grass, ran his bare fingers through the dirt where the snow had melted in a perfect circle, and held them to his nose. David watched from the ridge, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his teeth. Rigby said nothing. He mounted, stared toward the cabin for a long minute, then rode back toward town at a walk slow enough to be a promise. David understood that the fragile balance had just cracked. The land agent would not need a confession now. He would only need a witness, a shovel, and the right moment to dig. That night, David descended into the storage pit with fresh supplies and found Red Willow already awake, his face grave. The 2 men sat together in the lantern's small circle of light, aware that the walls around them were not thick enough to hold off what was coming. David spoke first, not of escape, but of the pipeline, of the steaming vent, of Rigby's cold inspection. Red Willow listened without interruption. Then he said simply that the spirits of the spring had been generous, but they could not protect against a greed that refused to be satisfied. The time for hiding was ending, and David would soon face a second choice harder than the first. The land agent would return with company, and they would tear the farm apart until they found water or bodies or both. When that hour came, David would have to decide what he was willing to sacrifice: the spring, the family, his own neck. There was no fourth option. Above them, the wind shifted, and the cabin timbers groaned under a fresh gust out of the northwest. Somewhere in the dark, a mule stamped nervously in its stall. David sat with the weight of Red Willow's words pressing down like the drift wall outside, and for the first time he let himself imagine the worst in full detail. The splintering door, the shouting men, the bayonets tearing through the straw where the two girls slept. And beyond that horror, an even colder question. If he was given the chance to save himself by leading Rigby to the spring, would he take it? He did not know the answer, and not knowing it terrified him more than any blizzard ever had. Rigby waited longer than David expected, but not long enough. He gave the farm a full week of false peace, letting the routine lull the household into something close to normal sleep. Then, on the coldest morning of January, he returned with 8 men. Not soldiers this time, but a hand-picked crew of Loop Fork's hardest cases, men who owed him favors or feared his ledger books more than the law. They carried picks, shovels, and a pry bar long enough to lift a barn beam. No warrant, no explanation beyond the grim purpose that hardened their faces as they fanned out across the lower pasture, where the thin vapor had been rising. David stepped onto the porch with his rifle cradled low across his arm, not raised, not yet, but visible enough that the men hesitated for a moment behind Rigby's lead. The land agent wore a heavy bear coat that made him look broader than he was, and the smile beneath his cold-chapped cheeks was the smile of a man who had already written the ending. He announced that the county had authorized a geological survey of all claims in the valley, prompted by reports of thermal irregularities that might indicate a hot spring of public value. David knew the claim was legal fiction dressed in fancy language. What it really meant was that Rigby had finally convinced the territorial authorities that a hidden resource was being withheld, and now he had a shovel crew willing to prove it. They dug first where the snow had melted, ringing the thawed circle with heavy swings. Frozen dirt flew in chunks. David watched 2 men hit something solid within 20 minutes, the hollowed cedar logs, still discharging a faint warmth that had kept the ground soft above them. Rigby knelt in the trench and ran his fingers along the sealed joints, his breath clouding in the cold. He looked up at David with the same expression Gideon Pike had worn years before outside the Vale cabin. Not amusement, not confusion. Recognition. He had found what he always knew was there. The men dug faster now, following the buried line up toward the ridge with the eager violence of hounds on a fresh scent. David's mind raced through a collapsing set of calculations. The pipeline traced a route that wound past the storage pit, less than 40 yards from where Blue Corn and the girls lay hidden beneath straw and darkness. If the crew followed the trench beyond the willow thicket, they would pass close enough to hear a child cough, close enough to notice the trampled snow where David had carried food to the lid each night. And beyond that, the pipeline climbed toward the dry wash, and from there to the false source he had prepared in the rocky outcrop on the far side of the ridge. The decoy was not a spring, only a slight seep where snowmelt ran over a submerged shelf of dark stone and picked up a trace of geothermal warmth from the Earth's deep rock. He had found it years ago while hunting, marked it as useless for anything but confusion, and now it was the only shield between Rigby's greed and the real canyon beyond the river bend. He decided to lead them toward it. Walking down from the porch, David called out to Rigby with a voice he forced steady. He offered to show them the source himself, to end the digging before it tore up his entire pasture. Rigby watched him closely, weighing the sudden cooperation, then nodded to his crew. 2 men stayed behind with shovels at the trench. The rest followed David up the slope, past the willow thicket, and toward the rock outcrop where a thin wisp of steam rose almost invisibly into the gray noon. They found the seep exactly as David intended, a shallow pool no wider than a bucket, warm enough to melt snow but too mild to boil, trickling from a fissure that a man could cover with both hands. Rigby knelt, dipped his fingers in the water, and scowled. It was not the roaring hot spring he had imagined, not the torrent of geothermal wealth. It was a tepid drip, barely enough to warm a watering trough, much less power a farm through Dakota winters. The crew muttered. Some looked embarrassed, others suspicious. Rigby's scowl deepened into something more dangerous. He had expected a bonanza and found a puddle, but his instinct for a deeper game would not let him accept the obvious. He ordered the men to dig around the seep while he studied the terrain with narrowed eyes. David stood aside, silent, letting the cold seep into his bones, and hopping it was enough to send them home. It was not enough. Because in the silence of the ridge, a sound carried upward from the willow thicket below. A thin, high cry cut off almost instantly, the cry of a child startled awake. Every man on the hillside froze. Rigby turned slowly toward the sound, and the expression on his face shifted from suspicion to certainty. He did not need to see the storage pit to know what it meant. He had spent years chasing the idea that David kept secrets. Now the secret had a voice. The crew abandoned the seep and descended the slope at a run, crashing through the frozen willows with the pry bar swinging. David ran too, the rifle still in his hands, but a heavy blow from behind knocked him sideways into the snow. By the time he regained his feet, his ears ringing, the men had already found the plank lid scraped clean of frost. They hauled it open, and the lantern light from below spilled upward, illuminating the pale faces of Blue Corn and the two girls, frozen in the terror of exposure. Red Willow rose from the darkness without a weapon, because weapons would have made the ending immediate. He looked only at David, and in that look was not accusation but an ancient, patient sorrow. Rigby held his men back from the pit with an upraised hand. He did not gloat. He simply stared into the hole for a long moment, then turned to the youngest of his crew and told him to ride for the cavalry outpost at full gallop. The Lakota fugitives were found, and the homesteader who had hidden them would answer for it before the day was out. They dragged the family into the daylight. Blue Corn clutched the smaller girl against her chest, while the older daughter pressed her face into her mother's skirt. The soldiers arrived within 2 hours, a full patrol under a lean lieutenant whose eyes held the flat, bureaucratic cold of a man who had executed orders like this before. He stood in the trampled yard, looked at the prisoners, then at David, and asked only one question. Where was the hot spring? Rigby had briefed him on the ride. The lieutenant cared about the fugitives as a matter of protocol, but he cared about the spring as a matter of career advancement. A fort built on a thermal source in the northern plains would earn him a promotion. He did not believe for a moment that the seep on the ridge was the end of the story. David was placed under arrest with his wrists bound to a porch post, and the lieutenant began his interrogation in the methodical rhythm of a man who had broken harder suspects. He did not strike David. He simply explained the situation as it stood. The family would be transported to the reservation under guard, but the father, Red Willow, had been identified as a holdout who had resisted relocation orders for over a year. The standing directive for such cases was execution as an example to other bands. The lieutenant was willing to suspend that directive, to list Red Willow as a surrendered non-combatant on one condition. David would lead them to the real hot spring before sundown. If he refused, Red Willow would be shot in the yard, in full view of his wife and children, and David would still hang for harboring enemies of the government. The choice was simple, the lieutenant said, and he would have an answer now. The cold tightened around the yard like a fist. David looked at Red Willow, who stood unbowed among the soldiers, his gaze still holding that ancient sorrow but now something else as well, permission. The old man had told him years before that a life spared must serve the balance. Now the balance had come due. David could almost hear the words again, spoken in the lantern light of the storage pit. The spirits could not protect against a greed that refused to be satisfied. The time for hiding had ended, but the choice was still his own. Lead them to the spring and break the promise. Refuse and let the man who had saved him die for nothing. And then, in the silence before the lieutenant's patience ran out, a third shape emerged from the edge of David's thought. Not a choice between the spring and the family's lives. A different covenant entirely. The spring was not his to give, because it had never belonged to him. But the land he owned, the quarter section that Rigby had tried to strip from him for years, that was his. And the legal authority to grant refuge on that land, once the Army's immediate interest was satisfied, might still exist in the tangled pages of the Homestead Act and the territorial codes. He did not need to betray the spring. He needed to surrender his ownership entirely, to turn his farm into a sanctuary, and in doing so, transform the accusation into a different kind of testimony. He lifted his head and asked to speak to Rigby alone. The lieutenant allowed it, impatient but curious. David's voice came low and steady, explaining a proposal that would reframe everything. And when Rigby heard it, the land agent's face went through three distinct stages: surprise, calculation, and a cold, reluctant admiration. Because David was offering not a hot spring, but a deal that would change the ownership of the land beneath their feet forever, and force every man in Loup Fork to choose what they valued more: water or justice. The agreement was drawn on a single sheet of paper, witnessed by the lieutenant and three men who would later deny they had ever been there. David signed over the entirety of his quarter section, not to Rigby, not to the county, but to a trust held jointly by Red Willow's family and his own descendants, a legal oddity that the territorial clerk accepted only because Rigby himself pushed it through. The land agent had finally gotten what he wanted: control of a thermal resource, or so he believed. The seep on the ridge was real, warm enough to be called a spring on a land claim, and David's signature on the deed meant Rigby could petition for development rights the moment the ink dried. What Rigby never learned was that the seep produced barely 12 gallons an hour, less than a kitchen pump, and that its warmth faded to nothing 100 yards downhill. The real spring remained where it had always been, miles away in a canyon the cavalry never searched. Red Willow and his family were listed as surrendered noncombatants and transferred to the reservation under guard, but the trust agreement contained a provision David had fought for through 3 drafts: the right of the family to return each winter to the quarter section as legal tenants for the purpose of agricultural consultation. The lieutenant had scoffed at the phrase. David had not. It meant the family could winter on the land every year without permission from anyone, and the Army could do nothing about it. The sacred water remained channeled through the buried pipeline, feeding the stock pond and warming the root cellar where Blue Corn's daughters had once hidden. The settlement never understood why the farm continued to prosper under its strange new ownership structure, or why the Lakota family appeared each November and left each March with the same quiet dignity. Most people forgot the whole affair within a decade, as frontier scandals buried one another like drift snow. But some memories do not bury. Years later, when the railroad survey cut through the hill country north of Loup Fork, a crew of engineers stumbled upon a canyon that steamed in the dead of winter. They found a pool of clear, hot water, ancient fire rings, and the faint trace of a trail that led nowhere near David's old claim. The company geologist declared it the source of the thermal anomaly everyone had once attributed to the ridge seep, and for a single season, a small resort was planned. But the land was found to be held in a federal trust for a Lakota band, protected by a treaty clause that had survived 3 wars and 2 relocations. No one could buy it, lease it, or fence it. The spring remained untouched, a secret that had outlasted every man who had tried to steal it. When word of the discovery reached Loup Fork, the old-timers who still remembered David gathered in the back room of Barden's store and pieced together the truth for the first time. The farm's warmth had never come from geology. It had come from loyalty so deep that a man had endured public hatred, arrest, and the loss of his land rather than betray the people who had pulled him from the snow. The hot spring the natives had kept secret remained secret, even after the white men thought they had found it. David had not hidden a resource. He had hidden an entire relationship. And in doing so, he had proven that some things are worth more than water rights, more than reputation, more than the land itself. What would you have done, standing in that frozen yard with a rifle in your hand and a family's life balanced against a promise you made in the dark? Would you have led the soldiers to the spring, or would you have found a third way that no one else could see? David Vale was not the smartest man in the territory, nor the strongest, but he was one of the few who understood that a secret is not a treasure to be spent, it is a trust to be carried. And sometimes, the people who carry it longest are the ones who never speak of it at all. Subscribe now and decide for yourself. Was his life a lesson in loyalty or the loneliest kind of sacrifice?